but basically I've been digging into navigation stuff for Compose. At least that was the idea behind going into this thing. But obviously getting into it, I was already kind of starting, and I had done a project using navigation stuff in Fragments. There's a lot of similarities between the two, so that's kind of how I might introduce this, I guess, is kind of do a quick run through of the navigation stuff that happens in the world of Fragments, and then how it kind of happens in Compose. And it's very easy to translate it. In fact, I almost think it's like better almost to understand it that way, even though the Compose thing makes it understand it really easily, I guess. So that's kind of what I'm talking about here. The only 3 points I have over here is to mention that Android came out with a library or a framework, I guess, in some essence, called Navigation Components, which is part of their overarching Jetpack infrastructure. They're like opinionated form of making apps and providing libraries for certain things. So Navigation Components is one of those features for navigation. Prior to this, you had fragments done in whatever the way fragment transactions worked, which honestly I didn't work with much, so I can't really say. And you obviously had things like activities being started with intents pretty directly and whatnot, which kind of still relates to how it is right now, but you can kind of start them differently. So yeah, Navigation Components brings in a couple abstractions of navigation layers, and at some, in some way you're basically not talking to features directly. A is not talking to B for navigating. A is talking to navigation components, and the navigation components does the rest of the job for actually navigating, which is pretty sweet. And there are 3 primary components of navigation components. I'll just mention that right now before I get into the app. Those are the nav host, the nav graph itself, and then the nav controller. So maybe they don't make much sense right now, but I will share an app really quickly so I can kind of get into it. And it is this. Okay. So, okay, I can probably just share both of them at the same time, I guess, but whatever. So one of the apps that I worked on this year was a side project. It is the museum app for the SAC museum, I guess. Strategic Air Command, I forgot what it was called. So maybe a long story short version is that the views are all made in Compose, but because at the time of writing, I didn't use, or they didn't have navigation, so I used fragments for navigation. And so each fragment is a screen. And so I'm using navigation from fragments for this, but the views individually are made in Compose. So I won't go into the views too much in this one. I don't use any Compose navigation in this at all. But I'm using this as a quick example to talk about the navigation stuff. I'll kind of run through the code really quickly after this. So it's basically made of this home screen. It obviously has a screen over here. Can you guys see the mouse, by the way, if I point it around? Okay, cool. So the home screen is kind of over here. You have the bottom tabs, which is obviously a key part. And in Android land, obviously, bottom nav is a cool thing to work with once in a while. And also, like, if you keep on clicking on a screen, it just kind of pushes a fragment over it. You can kind of click back and go back. Each of those views, as I said, are composables, and so not digging too much into it. That's just kind of how the views look like. I think if there's like nested views, it's kind of the same thing. It's pushing a fragment and pushing another fragment on top. Very random thing about this app is like it's almost entirely server driven. I think like 95% of it is driven from the server. A lot of these layouts and stuff, we basically just wrote a secondhand library just to render a lot of Compose views. So it's pretty neat. It's very lightweight, the app, but yeah, the navigation is done entirely in fragments for this one. I think I can upgrade it at some point and use Compose views. So yeah, some things to keep in mind is like this home screen and then the bottom tabs. I'll let you try to share both at the same time. Give me a quick second if I can do that. This goes here. Will this work? Oh, what's the heck? Whoa, I think I just broke my screen thingy. Okay. Let's just show this. I can probably just chat through it instead. So the app itself just had one activity the whole time, as do many apps these days, at least if you're making new ones. So where's that? Sorry, I'm just gonna try and do it really quick. Yeah, so the app just has one activity. It's the main activity, and just kind of running through how the whole thing looks like. The only thing that the main activity holds is a navigation host, which is one of the three components I talked about earlier. So when we do talk about nav hosts, it is essentially a container, and it is at some point, I think, a fragment container of sorts. And that is like the area, I guess, of your view that you are using to navigate around. So in this case, like one of my screens, the entirety of the base screen is like a main screen, I guess, and it is in itself a navigation host or nav host, which you can see over here is what it ties to being a navigation host. So the navigation host points to a nav graph, and your nav graph is what kind of talks about the different areas of our code that the navigation host can go to. So in this case, if I just see which navigation graph it's pointing to, which is the main activity one, it's way over here, nav main activity, and it only has like two fragments. So it has the bottom fragment, which is not just the bottom part. The bottom fragment is essentially the entire screen with the bottom tabs, but it also has another fragment that can load the entire screen over the entire screen. So that's all the main the parent navigation had. Unfortunately, I never ended up using the second one, so I don't have a good example for it, but in the second app I show, I can probably show a better example of this. So yeah, the home screen only has the bottom navigation fragment, essentially what you see, which is like the fragment which has the bottom tabs and like everything that you were saying basically was the bottom navigation fragment pretty much. So if I have to dig into this one, the bottom fragment itself, it is essentially this layout over here. So the bottom fragment, and maybe I should actually, it might be easier if I do show that again. All right, I'm gonna try this again really quickly. This goes in. Oh no, never mind. It's not squeezing both of them in the same thing. So I'm gonna stop for like 1 second just so I can get both of them on the same screen. Oops. Usually, like if you full screen Mac windows, you can put two of them side by side, but I don't know why I can't do it with this one. Okay. Oh, I guess this might be one way to do it. Okay. So yeah, so this entire screen is like the main activity I was talking about. The bottom fragment is also this screen. You can imagine the main graph that I was showing previously being like a parent version to it. And it's a parent version because if I want to show anything over the screen, I can show it. So if you have like any modals or something, I can kind of show the modal over this whole screen. Again, we ended up not using that concept in this app, and I'll have another app that probably does that better. So the bottom navigation fragment itself is basically this screen. So the fragment container is like this area on top, and then the bottom part is this bottom navigation view. So this is the bottom navigation view, and this is another navigation graph. So like those are the separations there. So if I had to see what the navigation graph includes in this case, it's the navigation bottom, or nav bottom navigation. Should have renamed that, I guess. And this one clearly has a couple more destinations. It has like the home one. It has basically one for each one of these buttons. And one of those the bottom navigations basically, because those are essentially what's hard coded. It's like I had to let it know that here's the different navigations that the bottom tab can go to. So here's what the navigation graph looks like. So the bottom navigation buttons are separate, they're views. But the navigation graph that's the top over here can either go to like the home fragment, which it's on, exhibits. It's basically each one of those tabs that are there. So that's kind of like what the navigation graph looks like. And just like inspecting one of the graphs slightly more, it's basically just an ID that you give to this like destination per se. So if I'm going to like the exhibits fragment, I will end up using like its ID over here as like the destination when I use it. I'll show you an example in a bit as well. Trying to see if I'm missing out anything here. Like this is like the class that it's going to launch when I use it. And then I'll talk about arguments in a second. But this is like what a navigation graph looks like in the XML code. I don't have the project on this machine, but there's obviously a visual element to the navigation graph as well, which kind of looks like this. This is obviously not the same app, but you're able to like use the UI more for like dragging destinations and whatnot. And you can also kind of specify, it's really easy, like to build like the argument passing and stuff pretty easily. But the reason I'm showing most of this stuff is because like already the navigation graph and the navigation host are like two separate files, and then you're binding them together in a third file. So for example, for like that main activity part, and this is where like that third component of navigation comes into place. Each nav host provides you something called a Nav Controller, which is essentially like that class. It's the object you use for actually making the navigations and whatnot. And so you have to find, I guess, basically each navigation host provides it, or you have to make one for it and attach it to a nav host. So it's basically the third step of your navigation. It's like once you put the host and once you have graphs kind of explaining what the host looks like, you use the Nav Controller as the abstraction to chat with it and whatnot. So I'm not going to go too deep. I just provided to the dagger graph, and I'll show you an example where I use it. So I'm just setting the Nav Controller here. Find Nav Controller as a function from the activity. I just have to pass it the ID of the navigation host. So an example of using it is somewhere where we do the navigation. So like hopefully ignore some of the side code that's going on. And also like this is GitHub's IDE, and they're not like highlighting syntax for Kotlin. So I mean, I just think that's a problem on their side slightly. Not really happy with that, but anyways. So yeah, the Nav Controller, I've just injected it up here. I just have a provider that's giving me either the screen level or the activity level one. I'm not going to go too deep into the difference, but one gives me like a full app modal if I wanted to. Basically, it gives you a navigate function that allows you to navigate into those different areas of the app. So the idea for the ID for one of those navigations was the SD fragment, or like which is like just a holder fragment for all our data. That's the ID I have to use for the navigate function, and then it looks at the graph and then finds that destination based on the ID and then navigates to it automatically. It's very simple, obviously, plus I don't have to literally create an object for that fragment. I'm just using like a number. In this case, an ID is just a compiled number. If I want to pass arguments, of course, I can just create a bundle object and I pass in arguments like a map. In this case, I'm passing the endpoint and like a hacky way to show the back button or not. Not really happy. That's just what that is. And then it also lets you pass in some extra options. And in this case, I am passing, how do I want the animation of a screen to look like when it's being created and exited? In this case, like, when you click on a screen, it kind of slides in and then it slides out once it's done. That's basically what's going on over here. Like slides in and then it slides out, but it kind of slides in and holds and then holds and then slides out. If I take out the hold, it actually kind of glitches really weird. So those are optional parameters, honestly. And in the other app I show, you can also ignore passing any nav options, and you can ignore passing any bundle variables as well. But this is like a quick, long story short version, I guess. I mean, it took a little bit, but there's 3 components, and in this case, I have it in like 3 different files. And actually, in reality, there are 3 different files. The Nav Controller is bound in the activity file. The host is in like the layout file, and then the graph itself is in like this graph directory over here that you bind into the host file. So that's kind of like what it looks like right now, I guess, in fragment mode. So then moving to an example for the Compose version, I guess I'm just going to share the phone for a second here. Like I just made a quick app yesterday to explain some of the stuff. It looks pretty damn horrible, but I mean, it kind of explains the idea. Okay, so this is like, there's only colors in this app and maybe it's like 3 words. And this is kind of going through somewhat similar concepts. And I'll kind of touch on each one. So it's just another screen. There's like a toolbar, there's a content area, which is this black area over here, and then there's a bottom navigation bar. So if I click on something like red, it goes to a red screen. This is not like one screen that's changing colors based on the bottom. It is actually like different content. Here I have like a screen that has 3 different options for 3 different colors. And then the 4th one, I have like this slider one, I guess that's a little more different than the others. So it's a screen that has 4 bottom navigations. I also added a drawer layout over here. And if you click on the drawer, it does a full screen kind of pop up. I'll talk about the animation thingy in the end, but it gives me like this full screen modal. And I'm not doing any logic here to like hide the bottom nav or anything. It is like in fact going over the other part of the app, because when I pop it, it's still in that same area. So it's some basic navigation functions you might be using otherwise. And this one is entirely using Compose. So let me try and once again find a way if I can share this really quickly. So this one can go here. This one can go here. This goes here. Okay. Sorry about the excessive screen switching that's going on. Okay. So to chat about this one, this is obviously a very simple looking app. It is built kind of similarly. It has like a parent screen, which is the parent screen composable. Oh my god. Okay, that for a second. It's like I didn't index this or something. It's going awfully slow. So this is all the parent composable looks like. Unfortunately, I didn't like make any previews for this mostly. I was just kind of running through the, I guess the phone live template thingy. So the parent composable consists of like the entirety of the screen again, not just the bottom, not just the top part. It includes like the entire screen itself. And I can talk about why I did that in a second as well. But already here itself, I basically had to make a navigation host. I had to make a controller to that host, and I also had to make a graph for like the home screen and maybe some of the modals that I talked about, the ones from the jar basically, so that they could take up the entire screen. And so already you can kind of see the main difference here. I have all those encapsulated, or I'm able to do it all in like one composable, basically all in like the same file itself. I don't have to like go to 3 different files. Just to talk about what's going on here, kind of like the navigation host and the other one, a nav host is a composable, at least the version that's provided for Jetpack Compose. So essentially you can think of it as a kind of like a view item and whatnot. So if your composable just returns this, and you have like a valid like root destination or something, then it takes that and puts it as that composable that's returned here. So in this case, like my start destination is home, and then it looks at the graph, which is basically this thing over here, finds home, and then just returns that composable. So home screen is like the home composable that I used. And this could like literally just be text item if I wanted to. This could literally just be a text field that says hello, and it'll still like show a screen that just says hello as well. So it's pretty simple that way. But it has all those components. It has the nav graph down here, the nav host, and then I'm hooking the nav host to the nav controller. I guess something, depending on how much, understanding there is of Compose, remember Nav Controller is from like Jetpack Compose themselves. A lot of the remember terminology itself is basically a way for Jetpack Compose to like remember the state of a function beyond its execution point, because Jetpack Compose is entirely based of like functions, and unlike like SwiftUI is based out of structures and some other, there's alternative DLL or DSL UI view rendering methods that are usually based off of classes instead. Compose went with functions. So using the composable annotation and like the remember functionality of states and whatnot, they're able to like save the state of something beyond just the completion of that function, because essentially it's still a function, but they use the remember word in a lot of places as a way to notify that this is something that Compose is giving you that's probably going to stay longer than the state of just the function itself. There's a lot of obviously back-end stuff going on there. An easy way to say, it's just an easy way to understand it is like, it's their way of like managing state to some extent. So I have an example of like storing a number. I guess I can show that as well in a second. But yeah, so Compose gives us just a simple remember nav controller, which returns a nav controller. This is not my function. I just attach it to the nav host, and it kind of just works out automatically. It's pretty sweet. So in this case, then I am going to the home screen, which I can show. It has a lot more going on in it. Of course, it's a little more. I could have probably broken it out a little better, I guess, and I tried some things that didn't work, but it's just this is the screen that includes like the title bar, the middle section over here, and then includes the bottom navigation. And you can kind of see that with the bottom bar, which defines like that bottom navigation. It includes the toolbar area, the top bar, sorry, and then it also includes the jar content, actually. That's also part of the screen. And then obviously just the area of the screen over here, which is part of this thing over here. Sorry. So if I had to take a look at like, what does the nav graph of this area look like, the home nav graph? I just tied it to the home nav host, which is also a view, right? Like the nav host is just a view in some way. It finds its own root view and starting destination to run. The home nav host, which is like this screen, just consists of all those similar bottom navigation IDs, or the same, draft that the other app had. It has just the bottom navigation ones. And then it just has like the screens that I'm taking it to, which is just either a color screen, the color choices screen is a little different. It's just another nav graph. I'll talk about that in a second. Or a color maker screen, which is like the fourth one, this one over here. So it's just defining a couple of those different, just those entries that I have at the bottom. If I had like another bottom navigation item, I'd have to add it to the home navigation host pretty much. So let me go back here. So that's like the view in the center of what's going on. The bottom navigation itself is literally just a composable view of bottom navigation. This is from Compose, and it's just letting me use it just automatically does like the sizing and stuff. So bottom navigation item is also from Compose. I can just give it like 3 or 4 items, and it automatically sizes out the bottom. It has like selected, unselected. I just don't have any selection state in this, so I just kept them all false and just listened to the click listener in this case. Really nothing too fancy going on here. One thing probably to know here in this area, because the bottom buttons are what navigate the screen, is that I am essentially passing the nav controller that the home screen made down to this area. So I made a navigation controller at the home screen level, so it's just at this level. So basically this guy's his navigation host over here, this area. And I'm passing it to the like the bottom navigation, so they can navigate this area over here how they want to. So I used the similar navigation, remember nav controller over here. It's making a new one. I have the parent one as well if I wanted to do anything. And the parent one, I am actually passing the parent nav controller to the drawer layout, because I want the drawer to come up in front of all of my data, or all of my, like the entire app basically. But because I want, just the bottom nav items to touch like this window over here, I made another one, a nav controller here, and I tied it to the nav host that's just in the body area, which is like the home nav host basically. It's like tied over here. Like the home nav host is tying to this nav controller, which is just this middle area. So that's kind of like, I guess, a basic version. I can maybe explain some of this, just kind of go a little deeper, I guess. I tried 2 different types of like nested. I guess nested is not the right. Maybe nested is like I'm already in the bottom nav and I go 1 screen deeper. So I tried 2 different versions of that. One of them is really wonky, honestly. Questionable on like some of the practices here and like I found online, honestly. So I mean, I'm not sure like what the best practice is. I looked at a couple of samples. Seems like we're all doing the same thing, but I feel like if it was a larger app, then at some point, like how do you remember like what navigation controller you're using and whatnot? Do you store it in like a third-party file and whatnot? So like this choices screen, you can go like 1 layer deep. So I'm like in the science screen, and you can go 1 layer deep because if I go back, if I press back, then I'm like back in the screen pretty much, right? Same thing with the yellow one. So if I'm in yellow, I press back, I'm back here. So it's like kind of maintaining that stack that's going on. And so like just to look at that really quickly, that is the where is that? That is the color choices screen, which is literally just a list it is just a list of all of those different color choices, and then it lets me navigate into each one of them individually. So I believe like if I'm navigating to yellow, I'm just going 1 more layer into yellow. I actually have to see which controller I was using here. Color choices nav. Oh yeah, it's being. I obviously have a navigation host file for the color choices. So like, I guess like that's one like I had to wrap my head around, was like the nav host is also like a compose. It's like a view in itself. So the host for the color choices is basically this screen, and this screen is basically saying like, just go to the home color choices color first, which is this list of items over here. After that, I can either go to the cyan, yellow, or white color if I want to, depending on what I'm doing. So that's all that's going on here. I pass it down to like the list screen, and then each one just navigates to whichever one it wants to go to. It's kind of nice. I can kind of keep it, like these navigation items are not tied to the parent one either, which is pretty cool. And it has like its own graph in some way. You can also like tie different graphs if you wanted to. I didn't do it in this app. I didn't find it a good use case. But this is just me saying, like, kind of just giving an example of like I have a navigation graph in one of these screens. I also have a navigation graph on the parent screen, like on the whole screen. So there's already like 3 nav graphs being operated on right now, which is pretty sweet. Then depending on which one you pass down and use, you can pull and push things however you want to. The fourth one I did a little differently, I believe. I'm not using a navigation graph of this screen in this composable. So let me just look at this one really quick. Oh my god, it's not this one. It is the custom color maker screen. So yeah, it's a custom color maker screen. This screen, I wanted to try something different. I basically just passed the homes, the screen that holds all of this information, the homes composables navigation controller to it, just because I wanted to play around with one thing in specific. So the color maker screen just has a couple sliders and a button, and I can basically, it will pass data to a new screen, and that screen gives me like the color that I passed. It also makes the things rotate, and I was doing that as a way to know how to go back and whatnot in this case. So a couple things are going on here. I guess first of all, it lets me push another screen on the same home nav. So like basically within this window. So it's not really, I can say it's not I didn't make a new navigation host for this. I'm using the same one that's using the bottom tabs as well. So this is like, I think it's not the proper way to do it. I just wanted to see like what the interaction stuff would be, I guess. One thing that I was able to do though with that is I found out that you could, oh, whoops, wrong one. Oh, actually, never mind. It's exactly the file I want to go to. Basically, the nav controller, anytime you make a nav controller, you're able to have a function. You have access to a function that's called current backstack entry as a state, which is also a handy function from Compose. It lets you, it's basically the state of your backstack in composable state. So what that means is like, I guess a good way to explain some of that state thing really quickly would be, so like this screen on the right is like the screen on the left in code. I mean, I ignore the fact that I didn't share the code, of course. I mean, going first try with this stuff, but basically have a number for each one of those states for red, blue, and green, red, green, blue. So when you use the remember thing, as I was talking about earlier, it's kind of holding that state, even though the function, it's kind of done executing, right? This wouldn't work in a typical functional scenario. Compose gave you the remember that lets you hold the state. So essentially also what remember and how the state functionality works in composable is that it's like, in some way it's like automatically reactive by nature. So like, here's like the text and the slider for the red color. All I'm doing is like each time I slide it, I'm just setting the number of the slider to the color, and then all I'm doing in the text is like setting the color or setting the text of that text field to the red number, right? That's literally all this is doing. But this is just showing that it's like automatically reactive, right? I don't have to like, RxC subscribe to anything or coroutines wise collect anything, although you can use collections in some places that you have coroutines. It's just reactive by nature in some way. It's kind of automatically hooking in. And Compose does the underlying magic of saying like, oh yeah, this composable text is looking at the variable R, which is hooked up to a remember type, which has a state. So now you changed it, so it's going to update automatically. The same thing is being done by the function response of the current backstack state entry. So each time I switch one of these, anything that's using my backstack state is reacting and like listening to it. In this case, I have some really dumb logic to know if a view or the composable or where I am in this app is nested or not to some extent for just this screen, not this screen. I didn't use this logic on this screen. It only works on this screen. So it's nested, it looks as the routes. I have a list going on. It just checks if the current screen I'm on is part of like one of those four. And so when I'm like launching this screen here, it's not one of those part of those four. It's a different screen. This is like a modal screen I made. So it's false to that otherwise, or it's true to nested, otherwise it's false usually. But again, that's like the thing that I'm using for rotating the button on the top when I'm just going to the screen. It's like once I'm in the screen, I'm not in the bottom tabs, I'm technically in a different screen, and so I just let it rotate based on that. But it also just automatically stops rotating because of this function. So this is possible because of a backstack entry thingy that exists, which is really handy. This is like kind of, like I was wondering if they're going to have a listener or something. Luckily, they just provide that at the state. So it works out really cleanly. Maybe the last thing I'll touch on really quickly, I guess, would probably be actually I already probably showed this, but when you're passing custom arguments, unlike the XML version of the fragments one that I was talking about, it has like a very URL-ish looking kind of thing, which is kind of nice. So like, I should probably just split this. So let me find out where. Okay. Oh my God, it's not that one either. Okay, great. Basically, so in my navigation graph for this area over here, I guess. Oh yeah, this area over here. So one of the as part of the navigation graph, I'm basically telling it that one of the screens that I'm going to go to can take arguments. And so I had it in the navigation graph one, you have to do that in the XML file, or visually you kind of add a plus button, add arguments and stuff. Luckily, you have the same thing going on here, but you can do it all in that, like Kotlin DSL language, very easy to write and read. And it looks very, as I mentioned, like URL-y type, so it's kind of like friendly if you honestly are just parsing URLs through deep links and whatnot. So deep links kind of work the same way, and you can kind of hook into like this routing system pretty easily with that. So this is like this is like the definition of this composable, being able to accept arguments, and then I'm passing arguments using, again, the one Nav Controller, which is like the one abstraction I have access to over here. And then based on the nav graph, I'm just like defaulting to 0, I guess, so it's not going to crash or anything. I have never worked with the one plugin that those guys have on navigation, which gives you the safe argument that because it uses the same class. I guess if I honestly forgot to mention that, like the navigation host and the Nav Controller, these are like extensions written or functions written for returning navigation hosts and stuff, but they are under the hood, like they are using like the same navigation host and navigation controller like implementations that like the normal, like the fragment version had as well, which is really nice because you're able to interrupt if you wanted to at some point. Again, I'm not doing it over here, but it just gives an added kind of thing. Last thing I'll touch, I guess, it's not even something that I guess really show here. Okay. Basically, I was also looking at how I could do some of the animation stuff I had going on here. And apparently they just don't have it built in really well with their current implementation of navigation as much in their normal framework. So like I tried just passing nav options because, as I said, I can use it's using like the same navigate function. So even if I used this, I thought I could just use this function in the composable version and it would work, but it doesn't work. It apparently just didn't work like that. So when I looked online at how to do this, some folks were saying like literally, animate it yourself. Like you could technically animate a composable yourself, I guess, when you show it, when it's like presenting. But I do think like some of that, I feel like because it's the navigation presentation, then maybe the navigator should take care of that and stuff. Oh, sorry if there's background noise signal around. But apparently, yeah, there's a library that's called, if I can hide this. There's a library that's called Accompanist, which is a Google library, which basically, it's just a lot of helper utils for Jetpack Compose from Google. So it has a lot of like just a lot of utilities, from pagers, permissions. I mean, these are just a lot of extensions that you might be writing otherwise yourself at some point, but these guys have written it out and put it out as a library. I haven't worked with this yet, but they do provide a navigation composable animation thing, kind of like what I was looking for essentially in this. So in their sample code, they're kind of doing the same stuff where they're providing a animated nav host where you can set different transitions based on what you're doing, which is like essentially what I was looking for. I guess I was assuming again the interop would work, but I'll give this a shot maybe and see if it works out. But yeah, so I thought that was pretty cool. I think the library is really cool. It has a lot of different, a lot of different modules in it. So I still have to play around with this library. I only found about it late today, so hopefully I can get back to it. But that's all I have to